Hello everybody and welcome to another video. And today we're going to talk about game design. Yeah. So with my fun little word cloud here, who doesn't love word clouds? Today I want to talk about game design from the perspective of changes in games. This came up a little while ago with the idea of the Age of Sigmar and some things changing, but it was sort of crystallized in my mind actually today as I was having a conversation with Matiram around just discussion about points that had changed, and he made a comment about a statement I had made on Warhammer Weekly in regards to the change in the movement phase. And I'm very keenly aware of changes in games. And I think that often as players, we think a little flippantly about change in games. We say, why don't they just change this? Bah. And it's so simple and so easy. And we treat it as though it's this obvious thing and it's only good side and there's no problem and it's just completely impossible to imagine why it wasn't done. Why isn't this change done? All you need to do is insert your change here. Okay? So I liked this slide because this was a fun little slide of sort of a bunch of different game design words and game design things. So a lot of fun there. And so what's we're going to talk about? We're going to talk about change in games. Because ultimately, what I am going to try to convince you of by the end of this presentation, the end of this video, whatever this is, I don't know, this little bit of time wasting to entertain you while you paint, is that change in games is far more complicated than how it's usually construed. So let's start here. Where are we going to start? We're going to start with Candyland. Now, Candyland is one of the simplest games of all time. Its designers have said that it is a game without choice. That is the point. It literally has no choice. There are no choice points. It is a game of luck determined by the sort of shuffling of the cards and whatever. It's just sort of revealed to you kind of who will win. But in fact, it is a very hard determinism game because it is all set the moment the cards are done. Now, the newer version with the spinner does actually create some kind of randomness, but there's still no choice. We'll go ahead and skip the deeper conversations about the nature of fate in the universe. And instead, what I'd like to talk about here is use this to exemplify change in games that are almost completely good. Okay? This is what I would call the best case of a change in a game. Now you'll notice I have what you're staring at here is two different boards of Candyland, and at first glance they may look very similar, maybe even the same. However, they are very different experiences because of one small change that had huge consequences. Okay? And you'll notice that underneath the black circle in both of those. So the one on the left is the older style Candyland board. And you'll notice that the final square is purple. Now, the objective at Candyland is to get to Candyland, to get to the castle. And you can only do that by getting that color square card. So you can sit there on that space, and if you don't get purple, you can sit there for a long time while the rest of the players catch up to you. You could be miles ahead of the rest of the people in Candyland as they slid down, candy waterfalls or whatever, while you're just sitting there stuck on purple waiting for a purple card that may never come. Okay? When you look onto the right, this is the newer board. This change happened fairly recently. But what was changed was that the final square was made a rainbow. So once you get to the final square, the next step to get to the candy castle, to get to the win, is to draw any card. Because any color card will satisfy that rainbow square. Right? Now, I was lucky enough to attend a talk given by one of the head game designers at Milton Bradley. And he said, when I die, I would like it written on my tombstone that I made the final square in Candyland Rainbow. That was his decision. This guy is a game designer who's been in the business for years, decades. He is a very, very, very accomplished figure. There are people who submit their games to this guy because he can make or break their entire life. Okay? In other words, he's kind of a big deal. And what he is saying is one of his most proud accomplishments, his epitaph he wants, is this change in Candyland. Because it's so small, and yet so big and impactful to the play of the game. Now, I want to say two things about this. One, this is actually three things. One, this is mostly upside. That is to say, this is about the most upside you can get in a game change. It makes the game more fun, more fast, easy. It eliminates a lot of frustration. Two, it is not complete upside, right? Because the fact that the last square could trap you and hold you could mean that other people could catch up. So it does change the game experience. And there could be people who liked that game experience, okay, of being caught on that last square and having a chance to catch back up. All right. And finally, three, a lot of people simply house ruled the rainbow square before this change was ever made. Okay? So, regardless of what the designer did, people were playing Candyland in the way that they thought was the most fun. And I don't think Milton Bradley had an issue with that. So, my point being is that this, in this incredibly simple game, is still not a change without controversy, and it often didn't matter because people were just solving the problem on their own. People are pretty smart. They tend to do that. The next kind of change I want to talk about is what I call 6 of one, half a dozen of another. Less exciting slide here, much less bright colors. 6 of one, half a dozen of another are changes in games that are fairly irrelevant and often simply personal taste. And this is a nice, simple little spreadsheet example of that. So what you're looking at here is 2 experience progressions of what it looks like in 2nd edition for a fighter with 2 classes to go up, and a fighter in 5th edition with 2 classes to go up, or single and 2 classes. Whatever. What you'll notice is that there are some numerical differences and things like that. But this is one of those changes that if we just take, what I want to focus on here is not the 2-class piece, but the single-class column, so the first one. You notice these numbers are much different in how they progress. Yet there are still points of overlap. So if you look, I get to 2nd level very fast, 300 experience in 5th edition, 2,000 in 2nd, right? But if you go all the way down to 17, they're the same number. Okay? In other words, this is just a change in sort of the way the game is. And when I say 6 of one, half a dozen of another, I mean it's probably about a 50-50 change. It doesn't really matter because in the end, what this is pointing at is something that most people are just going to play toward. So in other words, you're going to level at the speed you wanted to level at always in D&D. It didn't really matter what the chart said or what the experience in the monster manual said, because right there in the rules it said experience is a bit of an art. You give it out for what you want, whatever. So the second that was the rule, and that became how they empowered GMs, this table becomes fairly irrelevant. If you want a fast game, you're going to hand out 2,000 experience per game or something, and ramp it up accordingly. And people are going to rock it up. And that's fine. You can do that. If you want a slow game, you're going to hand out, in the left chart, you're going to hand out 100 experience per game. And people are going to take forever. Well, the same thing can happen over in 5th edition, right? I can hand out 300 and scale it appropriately, or I can hand out 50. You know, the point being is that in this case, it's a change, yes, but in the end, it doesn't actually impact play very much because, at least to the single class thing, because it can be played around. This is a very common thing, I think, that we often do when it comes to like recommending Warhammer changes, because there are things that are our personal taste. It should work like this and not that. And these aren't necessarily appeals to realism. It's just like, I think these guys should move this, not this. Or some little minor change. It's like, well, that's fine. It's some minor change. In the end, it's not really changing the play of the game. It's really just 6 of one, half a dozen of another. The game will still play pretty much the same. And there's a lot of small things like that. The point being, there's some good, some bad, but it's kind of not much of either, really. It's more or less just a change, almost for change's sake. But now let's get to the vast majority of changes, and this is what I really want to talk about. The good and the bad. So changes that have both wrapped up in them. And I didn't put a little pie chart in here because it would just be faking it, but I will tell you that if I had to guess, I think that when it comes to the good and the bad, 80 to 90% of changes you do in a game, or rules you write, period, if you're cutting from whole cloth, look like this. They have good and bad. And determining the percentage of that, i.e. is it 60% good and 40% bad, is often nearly impossible. All you can really do is say, making this change will appeal to this psychographic profile, a little more, or this one a little less. I've talked about those in the past, but the example I want to give before we get into deep to theory is skills in Dungeons & Dragons, okay? So what you're looking at here is the 2nd edition interpretation of skills here in the thief function table, the 3rd edition interpretation of skills in this big long chart off of a character sheet, and the 4th edition interpretive skills as represented by the sacred difficulty class table. Okay? So, 2nd, 3rd, 4th. In each of these, they are completely different takes on skill systems. Okay? In the 2nd edition system, these skills were relegated to a single class. These were things thieves could do. Now, certainly other classes got little bites at the apple, maybe the ability to move silently or hide or something. But for the most part, these skills were things thieves did. And if you weren't a thief, you didn't really do these, or you had to come up with a clever way to do them, or use a spell to do them, or something like that. But thieves had a hard mechanic, a straight percentage. And you'll notice that as time goes by, they get better at it, right? They actually improve. Now, this is off of a sort of average adjustment table. Keep in mind that you didn't actually evolve like this. Naturally, you assigned points, but it shows what I'm aiming at, which is that it was this sort of progression. If I'm 10th level, I have a 67% chance to open any lock I run into. That's just how it is. Now, certainly the GM could adjust that percentage, say it's a particularly difficult lock, but the world is fairly irrelevant. I just have this percentage. And for the most part, that will hold true. Not always, but it's not that there can't be adjustments. It's just it's not the assumed norm. Those are the outliers. For the most part, this is my number. And that skill set is relegated to this one group. Jump to 3rd edition, you'll notice this is the chart off of every single character's list. Now, not every character got every skill. They had to assign out points or whatever. But everybody was assumed, unless there was a trained only on it, which some could be done that way. So everything you see with a little black box is something that can be used untrained. In other words, you can just take a shot. No need to actually have any skills assigned. You can just take a shot. It was also assumed that, and you accumulate some bonus, and that's aiming at a difficulty in the world, assuming that the world gets tougher. Not so in the other way, the assumption was you get better. And just by the time you're high level, you've sort of mastered the world. In this, it's assumed that it's going to kind of move with you. that things in the world will get tougher. It's not always the case. Like when you're level 18, it's not like you only face level 18 threats, but things that are relevant to your level will have super high DCs and be very hard to do. The 4th edition one takes that and directly assumes that's the case. It directly assumes that if you're this level, this is the challenge, this is an easy, moderate, hard challenge for you, and calcs that out. And assumes that for the most part, that is the check you will be making. And the trick here is the math of 4th was so tight, you were never actually getting any better at anything. On the D20 roll, you had about the same chance of success at 1st level as you did at 24th level, assuming you were facing something relative to your level. It was always more or less a coin flip. Okay? Now, that little stroll down D&D nostalgia lane was to exemplify I wanted to give you some groundwork, because I want to ask the question, which one of these is better? If you played these games, which one of these do you like? Why do you like it? The reality is you can probably put your finger on something you liked about it. But what I want to make clear is that each of these have strengths and weaknesses. None of them is perfect. And by making the change, they also brought in bad things. And by the way, it's not like there's some mystical 5th system that can be designed without these problems. Game rules have downsides, have consequences. By doing X, you automatically get Y. Certainly you try to minimize the downside consequences, but they are always present. The advantage to the 2nd edition system was it made the thief special. He was a unique and beautiful snowflake. The downside to making the thief special is that everyone else is not. Right? They can't do these things. And if you don't have this guy, you could be screwed on an adventure. The upside to the 2nd edition one was that it made you feel better vis-a-vis the world. You felt like you were advancing. You were getting better. You were beating the world. The downside to that is you were beating the world, and if the GM wanted to really keep it challenging, then all these weird and unusual penalties had to start coming out, which then robbed you of what you seemed to be deserved. We can do this with every one of these charts, and I don't want to go into such detail because this is about game design, not specifically about D&D. But my point is that when we look at changes, we need to think very carefully about what else is the consequences of that thing. Because it's rare that any change is all upside. And this is one of the things that makes me respect many editions of Warhammer. That is to say, this is why I love 8th, and I liked older editions, and I like Age of Sigmar, because in each of them, my game designer brain sees the good things and understands that often the bad are just the consequences of those good things. Specifically, let's take a look at something like this. Let's take the movement, what sparked sort of this thought in my head. On the left, we've got some classic 8th edition, right? We've got some ranks and flanks, some things lined up, and we got our little unit down at the bottom, you can see there, right? We've got our little Phoenix Guard all in a nice little pretty row. On the right, we've got what a battlefield can easily look like in Age of Sigmar, just kind of troops spread about, right? And up top, we've got them running around on the battlefield. Now, good and bad. Let's apply what we've just talked about to this. What's good about the thing on the left? Well, what's good about the thing on the left are multitude. I'm not going to name them all. I am going to miss some. If there are some I missed, feel free to throw them in the comments below, because I am going to miss some. That does not mean I don't respect them. That just means I'm aware that I am a limited human being. What's good about it? Well, one, look at that picture. Those guys look sexy. A big block of troops. It just looks classic. That rank, that flank. You know, the base is all aligned on squares, looking good, looking like they're ready to march out for Ulthuan. It lets you pick pairings, right? So if you look up at the top picture, you can see how people have aligned block units against other blocks. And because of the restriction of how a block moves, I can sort of force pairings off where I want them to happen, right? And the way that they move has this very logical, structured sense to it. That block is going to go forward, it's going to turn. It's how this block moves. Something about it logically makes sense. What's good about the other form over on the right? Well, we can be more free with how we have our troops out and how they move. They can move around the battlefield more freely, right? They can get into terrain. That top picture, look at them occupying that terrain. That's not a thing you could have actually done. That's the legitimate place those models are standing. If your models were in that picture on the bottom left, they could not stand on that dais. You'd have to place them up there in some weird way. They'd be tipping off. But here, we can actually use these beautiful terrain pieces, run our models up, have epic clashes at the top of the Dragon Fate dais, right? Whatever. Okay. And I have more freedom to move around the board, to retreat, to fall back, to have individual guys or people march individually to block off things, and so on and so forth. Okay? Those are good things about both. They are mutually exclusive. That is to say, both are good, but the bad of them is that you cannot do the other thing, right? At least not without some kind of stretch. Both have bad on their own as well, right? One of the things I mentioned in the show that I had mentioned long before the conversation about things that people love to hate on about Age of Sigmar, a proud nail that has always bothered me in 8th edition, is the whole I stand an inch off to your left and you can't hurt me. It has bothered me to no end. It was something that I complained about on shows months ago. The tiny little individual Skaven standing an inch to the left of a giant and being more or less immune to that giant is something about that makes my brain hurt. And so, that's something that isn't a problem in Age of Sigmar. But at the same time, not being able to actually, block up into a phalanx and fight in a way that many may have classically fought easily because of the nature of how these figs are now based and such, also has a downside, right? That I can't represent that. My point being that when we say, hey, all we should do is change this, or this thing is only good, I think it's good to recognize that all game design choices have good and bad consequences. There's no freebies when it comes to game design. They all are going to have upsides and downstream negative consequences. And when we're going forward and talking about comp in Age of Sigmar or changes for 9th edition, I think it's good to keep that in mind because we need to be aware of the situations we're creating. And by the way, this is tough because a lot of these are second order consequences, so you can't even predict them, which is one of the things that's always challenged Games Workshop themselves. Because I'm not sure they ever really intended us to be blocking off, go back to 8th edition, shooting out one single model redirectors, a little warp block engineer. I'm not sure that was ever really in their head when they played the game, but it was certainly a consequence and became the norm, right? I could stop a whole block of 50 savage, marauding, insane orcs because a single giant rat was standing in front of them and shot them off to the left so they never even actually got into combat. I can't do that. That happens in one game, doesn't happen in the other. That doesn't make either game better. It just makes it a reality of the thing. At the same time, it's harder for me to do hard redirects in Age of Sigmar. And for people who like that style of play, a very sort of chess match of redirects and back and forth tactical moves where I counter your individual move in a very chess-like fashion, they're not going to find that in Age of Sigmar. And by the way, that's just as valuable of an experience, right? So the final thing I'll say is I imagine that a lot of people, when they talk about these changes, make appeals to realism. That is to say, this is right because it's realistic. I know I just hinted at it with the whole standing off to a foot to the left of the giant, right? That's an appeal to realism. The trick with that is that all games are an abstraction. And there is no right answer with this. There's no just, hey, we'll just do that thing, and that's the right amount of realism. Games come in all levels of abstraction, from chess, which is a hyper-abstracted concept of war, to highly, highly detailed, as I talked about on a pain episode when I showed like Phoenix Crusade or whatever, where there are 18 different tables to show when a bullet impacts someone exactly which organs are ruptured. So everybody's tolerance for realism varies. And an appeal to realism alone isn't enough, except to say, I like that level of realism. That's good. You should know what you like, and you should find the game that's appropriate. But my point is, there's no innate goodness or badness to it. All there is with these design choices is a set of good and bad consequences individualized to people's psychographic profiles. They will find that appealing or not. So, there you go. I hope that was entertaining. I've rambled on for a long time now. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Maybe some things, some changes that you've seen in Warhammer or other games that had good and bad consequences. But, as always, stay positive. Keep playing games, because there's so much goodness out there right now. It's a great time to be a gamer, and I certainly love all the games I'm playing, including both of these on the screen right now. Look forward to hearing what your thoughts are, and as always, we'll see you next time.